What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and Sony is apparently making a spin-off project about El Muerto from Spider-Man, and I don't know why, because this guy literally appeared in two comics. It's a two-part series in Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man issues 6 and 7 from 2005 called Masks, and that's it. After that, he's never seen or heard from again. I think he's referenced in the Civil War files as part of the 50-state initiative, but he has no meaningful appearances, so I have no idea how in the world they're going to make a spin-off project about this guy. But for those of you guys who are familiar with this, Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man was basically a spin-off Spider-Man title. Not really a spin-off, just kind of another Spider-Man title. That Spider-Man has always been so popular in Marvel Comics that for decades, they've been able to get away with running 2 or 3 different Spider-Man titles at the same time. And in fact, I think right now in Marvel Comics, they only have one. They've got the Amazing Spider-Man, and then you have Spider-Man Miles Morales. But for a long time, you had Web of Spider-Man and Amazing Spider-Man and Spectacular Spider-Man. You had all kinds of titles. So Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man was just the most recent iteration of that title, running up into really going into 2005. And so the idea behind this is really just kind of treating this like a regular story, because that's really all it is. Essentially it just kind of picks up with El Muerto basically fighting Peter Parker, wrestling Peter Parker. And we don't exactly know how we got to this point. All we really know is that we just have J. Jonah Jameson cheering on Spider-Man basically getting defeated by El Muerto. Now, the funny thing about this is normally you would expect Spider-Man to be able to overcome this guy quite readily, but there is a caveat to El Muerto, which is the mask that he wears. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But basically it allows him to go toe-to-toe with Peter Parker. So much so that this fight actually ends up becoming a little bit tougher than Peter Parker initially thought that it would. And despite all of his attempts, to dodge, bob, and weave, to come at this guy from different directions, none of it really seems to work. And so what this does is it actually jumps back to the past for really kind of a few panels, and it shows us that somewhere along the line, there was this guy whose father was arrested and had basically, he had killed a cop, right? So he was busted for capital murder, he was charged, imprisoned, and executed. And so because of J. Jonah Jameson's editorials, which were seemingly, as this guy interprets it, the reason why his father ended up basically being killed, because the governor would have pardoned him had his father been able to basically demonstrate that he was a new law-abiding citizen, that because of J. Jonah Jameson's editorial columns, that the governor chose not to. And basically this guy's father was essentially killed. And so where initially this guy's gonna kill Jameson and then kill his son in front of him, you end up having El Muerto who just kind of jumps in. Now, the funny thing about this is that El Muerto he's inherently Spanish, right? He's from Mexico. And so his English isn't all that great. But so the way he speaks is kind of funny, right? He's back away, the weapons are to be put down by you. And he even goes so far here is basically saying excuse my English, it's not very well, so I will use a universally understood language, the language of violence. Because as we've talked about here on Comics Explained so many times before, violence is not always the answer, but it is a answer, and it's usually a very effective one. And so basically El Muerto just beats this guy up. He literally just starts pummeling. And then once this guy's defeated, of course, he basically ends up freeing J. Jonah Jameson and his son. Now, when the question's asked by Jameson, how in the world did you even know to come here in the first place? The response of El Muerto is, I've actually been watching you for a while. I've been trying to find the best way to approach you, and I figured you being tied up and about to be killed would probably be the best time to step in and make my presence known. And so again, you do kind of jump back to the fight between Peter and El Muerto. The reality is, it's ironically enough, it's kind of filler, right? This segment with Spider-Man is largely filler stuff, right? I mean, the two of them are wrestling and kind of getting the upper hand and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that had gone on here is that when Jameson was being held, he believed his son, and even for the first bit of the story, he believed his son was actually Spider-Man, that it wasn't Peter Parker. And the reality is that Peter Parker had talked Jameson into believing that his son was Spider-Man. Even though Robbie Robertson is your son and Spider-Man have been seen together at the same time. How is it possible that your son could be Spider-Man if he's standing right next to him? And so it's one of those funny little things. But nonetheless, because of the fact that Jameson had previously believed Spider-Man could do no wrong, because he believed his son was Spider-Man, as soon as that revelation turned out to be untrue, it was back to business as usual, right? It was back to Jameson just being a dick and always having it out for Peter and trying to take him out. Now, at that point, you switch over to the origin of El Muerto, which is really, really interesting, to be honest. So the whole idea behind this is there's this guy named Estrada, I think is how you pronounce it, or Estrada. I'm not 100% sure how you pronounce this in Spanish, but basically it's the father of El Muerto. And what it is that the role of El Muerto is really more of a title than anything else. That El Muerto is, by all standards of measurement, what you or I might call a luchador. Now, I'm not super familiar with Spanish wrestling. I know that there's a lot of heritage when it comes to luchadors, and there's a lot of tradition that's there. So it's not necessarily something that you scoff your nose at, right? I mean, there's a lot going on there in terms of history and significance and that kind of stuff. But essentially the role of El Muerto had been passed down to El Muerto's father from his father and from his father going back to somewhere along the line. And so in order to basically take on that mantle, one, El Muerto had been trained from it by his father since the day he was born, since he was a little kid. And two, he has to wrestle this unnamed guy, basically do battle with him in order to demonstrate that he's worthy of the mantle. If he fails, he will be killed. And that's exactly what happens. That in this moment, El Muerto basically backs off. He's like, no, I don't want to have anything to do with this. I don't want to be part of this whole thing that you have going on, Dad. It's nothing that I want to be a part of. But the fact that he's violated the tradition, both by basically demonstrating cowardice and backing away from a fight, and then by that very nature, losing, the response of this mysterious guy is that it's done, right? Like Juan Carlos, basically his life is forfeit. Because of the fact that he backed away from this, he dishonored the tradition, and he obviously is not living up to the mantle of El Muerto. His life is over with. His father actually ends up jumping in to save the life of his son, and then his father's head is ripped off. We don't see it on panel. I mean, it is a Spider-Man comic, right? I mean, Marvel's not really going to show us super gruesome stuff like that, but they will show us stories where Mary Jane Watson dies because of Peter Parker's irradiated fluids. We'll leave it there. Yes, that story did happen, and I don't know if it's in continuity. But because of the fact that El Muerto's father, Juan Carlos's father, had demonstrated bravery here, Juan Carlos himself is given 10 years by this mysterious guy. This guy's basically what he tells him is, you have 10 years to find your courage, if that's even possible. You have 10 years to train yourself, to become more capable, and at the end of that 10 years, I will come for you. And so in effect, because of the fact that El Muerto had saved the life of J. Jonah Jameson, what he wanted to do was basically challenge Spider-Man, because in doing so, he would be able to basically maintain his honor, right? If he's able to defeat someone out there in the world who is highly capable and is also masked, and then unmask them, it would basically prove himself being worthy in the eyes of this mysterious guy. Hence the reason why this whole match is set up. Now, the reality here is it is somewhat of a charity thing. They're not really fighting to kill, right? I mean, it's not like this guy's gonna kill Peter Parker in the ring. It's simply just whoever it is that loses basically gets unmasked. Now, Peter Parker does not initially know this, and that's one thing to specify here, that this guy basically at one point in the match, he says mascara contra mascara, which I think that's how you pronounce it. My Spanish is awful. I mean, it's really terrible. I apologize for you all out there who are of Spanish descent or who speak the Spanish language, and I'm just trouncing all over how things are supposed to be pronounced. I apologize. Spanish is not a language that I'm overly familiar with, but basically in saying that is whoever wins this match gets unmasked. Peter Parker, not realizing what's going on, just kind of blows off the statement. But as the two of them begin to continue on, this is when El Muerto basically tells him, because I'm defeating you now, when I win, I will unmask you. Peter Parker's like, what are you talking about? And he's like, you agreed to it, right? You literally agreed to that stance. Whoever it is that wins basically gets to unmask the other person. Now, in the midst of this, and because Peter Parker has the Iron Spider suit, and because this is still a point in his history when he's not overly familiar with it, in this battle with El Muerto, you end up having this kind of poison blade that comes out from the suit itself, which isn't enough to kill El Muerto, but it's enough to knock him unconscious. And so because of the fact that it appears that he's been defeated, the mysterious man watching all this unfold basically says, you failed, right? Your life is forfeit. And so at that point, you switch over to a hospital, of course, J. Jonah Jameson always having it out for Peter. He's like, obviously Peter did this on purpose, right? Obviously Peter, Spider-Man cheated because Spider-Man's a terrible person, and he rushed him here to the hospital, probably to assuage his guilty conscience, and then he's like, get me pictures of Spider-Man, that kind of a thing, right? The guy's just sort of being a dick. But ultimately, what ends up happening here is that as El Muerto begins to come to, of course, he's met by Jameson and he's met by Robbie Robertson, and they're like, look, man, you were basically knocked unconscious, temporarily paralyzed because of a poison that was injected in you by Spider-Man, that kind of a thing, but rest assured, everything's fine. You're in this hospital. There's no safer place to be, only for this mysterious man to appear out of nowhere. And what we end up finding out when Jameson asks who this guy is, he's literally like, I am El Dorado, right? El Dorado is this guy's name. Someone please explain to me how Sony's gonna be able to make a spin-off film about this. I can tell you right now, if Sony makes a movie about this, it's gonna be bad. It's gonna be a terrible film. Just bad. Like, Sony, for the love of God, just let me plan things out for you. Let me save you from yourself, please. Please let me do that. But nonetheless, right, the way this goes down is that you initially have Jameson who just starts talking trash to this guy, obviously, because as much as Jameson is a jerk, one thing you gotta credit him for is he almost never backs down, even when it's in his best interest to do so. He's just like literally talking trash to this guy. But in the end, like, El Dorado just like brandishes these two swords, right, these cutlasses, and it's like time to get down to business, right? So literally take out El Muerto. Now, the thing about this is, of course, Peter Parker, his spider sense, he senses something going on. He ends up tracing it to his genesis point where it's happening, and he arrives here on scene. And ultimately, a fight breaks out between him and El Dorado, to the point where Peter's actually able to overcome this guy. Not necessarily in like a straight up fight. It's really more bobbing and weaving and just kind of dodging attacks and different things like that. But for the most part, Peter's kind of outclassed here. Now, here's one of the things to know about this. This is before Peter Parker was trained by Shang-Chi, right? That happened during Jonathan Hickman's Avengers, the New Avengers. I need to go read that story again. But like, this is before Peter Parker learned his own martial arts style. And so up until this point, Peter Parker's fighting style was really more street fighting, if anything, right? It was kind of his own style, a blend of different styles that he'd learned over time. And so this guy being able to gain the upper hand is really more of the fact that he's just that prodigious of a fighter. Now, it's not like he's facing off against Taskmaster or anything like that, but El Dorado's pretty capable. And so all Peter really does here, at least all he can do when he tries to web him up, right? His webs are just chopped to pieces. There's nothing he can do. And Peter Parker basically just bails off and literally buys himself some time. Now, what he ends up doing, of course, is traveling to the laboratory. But one of the things that this guy El Dorado says is that his ability to track people is highly prodigious, right? He's very, very capable. Now, he doesn't really have a spider sense like Peter does, but he does have kind of like a sixth sense, as it's illustrated, or the ability to track people to particular locations. And so literally, once he shows up here on the scene and he realizes that Spider-Man is in this room, it's literally Spider-Man just kind of putting together a kind of cocktail. And as El Dorado's hunting for Spider-Man, and then like the moment he's about to catch him, then El Muerto shows up out of nowhere, and then kind of a fight breaks out between the two, even if only momentarily. Now, for El Muerto, this is a pretty big deal, right? The ability to basically overcome El Dorado to show that he is, if not the more prodigious fighter, certainly comparable to El Dorado in the sense that they're not necessarily equal, but he's still able to hold his own to a degree. Not quite, but to a degree. But in fact, he actually slips on some glass and then falls and busts his ass. But like, that's basically it, right? And so at that point, Peter Parker, of course, ends up throwing this chemical at El Dorado. Not gonna lie, man, I feel like it'd be hilarious if it were just like some kind of fear toxin or something like that, where this guy just starts hallucinating these horrible things and just runs off screaming. I feel like that would have been hilarious. I don't know why. I've got a twist. You guys know, man, I've got a kind of messed up sense of humor. But nonetheless, right? This of course basically buys them like just a quick moment of time. But in effect, Peter saves the life of El Muerto here, right? He literally just pummels El Dorado, sends him flying out of the room, and then of course, having been defeated, El Dorado takes off. And that's it, right? That's the last time that you see El Muerto. Like, as far as I'm aware, we've never seen or heard from him since. Like, that's it. It's him just kind of being like, thanks, Peter. And like, that's all there is to it, right? And so, my question here, I don't know how you make a spin-off project about this guy, because it's not like he's done anything important. He wrestled Peter Parker in order to unmask him to prove his worth to some guy, and then ultimately Peter Parker defeated that guy. Roll credits? I mean, is that what we're talking about here? I have no idea how they're gonna make it work. But with that being said, guys, we're gonna bring this to an end. Let me know in the comments if you think there's any possible way to make a compelling spin-off series about this guy, and I will catch you all later. Peace.